Hello and welcome also in the name of the Zabel Association. As said, together with Slovenian Mladinsko theater, we organized together tonight's discussion, Unannounced Voices. This discussion is actually based and it will evolve around the book by Zdenka Badovinac, a collection of essays by Zdenka Badovinac, Unannounced Voices, Curatorial Practice and Changing Institution. This collection of essays was published this year by the Sternberg Press as a part of the book series which is called Thoughts on Curating. And also let me present the speakers, the announced voices tonight with us. Zdenka Badovinac, curator and currently director of Museum of Contemporary Art in Zagreb, is joined by Charles Esche, curator and director of the Abbemuseum in Eindhoven, Ištvan Išt Huzjan, artist, Tjaša Pogačar, curator, co-founder and also co-editor of Šum, a journal for contemporary art criticism and theory, and Vesna Vuković, curator, art writer, also co-founder of Blok NGO and collective from Zagreb. Envisioned was also that Goran Injac, artistic director of the Slovensko Mladinsko theater, joins us in the discussion, but unfortunately, because of the unforeseen reasons, he is not able to be with us. My name is Urška Jurman. I work for the Igor Zabel Association and I will moderate this discussion. So, as said, the discussion evolves around the recently published collection of essays by Zdenka Badovinac, and idea is that discussion will be based on certain concepts, questions and ideas proposed by Zdenka Badovinac in this book. But before we start this talk, which I hope jumps over from this table into the also you audience, I invite you, Zdenka, to shortly outline, the book, the intentions behind this book, also maybe to present us the main emphasis. You wrote this book during the COVID pandemic and also during the growing authoritarian regime at that time here in Slovenia, and this very much also influenced your writing and your thoughts, reflections on the role of art institutions and curatorial practice. Somehow you opened the book with the question, what is our future and which voices will announce it? So please, if you can share with us maybe proposals on this question in the book, or maybe even if you have a dialogue with yourself back then, how you see your proposals offered by this book.
Okay, thank you, Urška. When I was invited to write this book, a small book, I was a little bit confused because the editor, he proposed me to write, and it is also part of the series on contemporary curating. So I was invited to write on the curating today, especially in times of lockdown, COVID, and the question how it will influence our future was present at the very beginning. As we know, here, parallelly to COVID, the authoritarian regime in Slovenia started almost at the same time. So my feeling was at the beginning that it's actually impossible to write something very general on curating, even less to put kind of overview on contemporary curating. So I somehow asked myself how to convey my particular position, how to convey my voice, about it. So how to put my situated voice in discussion here. So I conclude the book with a sentence that change is actually everything what it is this all about. So I think that change is something that defines the time we live in. It is very much about the accelerated dynamic of change. We know we go from one crisis to another, since refugee crisis, COVID, then political crisis, economic, many different crises that are following very fast, one after another, and we almost don't have time to digest, to really think what the crises are about. And on the other hand, there is also a strong demand, requests for the change, you know. So the change, demand for the change is coming from very different circles, especially from more active, of course, part of population. So the these two aspects, you know, that there is this accelerated dynamic and that there is very strong need for change, somehow orientated my approach to the to the question of curating in direction of the future. Although I didn't put explicitly the question there, what will be the future of curating of art or anything else. So there is no answer to this question, what will our future be like. And of course, you know, it's nothing new, so the art, the curating, also in the past, in the 20th century, we know that the avant-garde art was very much oriented as modernism to the future, like, you know, the concept of development, comparisons with science. The idea of the future was pretty clearer than today, so we even can talk about utopian totality, idea of the future. So today, if we think what is this, like a total idea of the future, is only a catastrophe, dystopia. But the art that I am referring and the model of curating in this book is more about the socially engaged practices, about activism, even about the protest art that demand the participation. So as soon we are in the question of the participation, the question of the future as something that we can imagine as totality is out. So we can't, of course, talk about a coherent idea of the future, because there are many different situated voices that participate now in this idea, not only in the idea but also in the production of the future. So the concept of the situated, I took from Dora Haraway's Situated Knowledges, text from the end of the 80s that inspired also our work in Internationale, the confederation where we, since some years, have been talking about the situated museums. So we have, you know, situated voices, we can talk about situated curating, we can talk about situated museum institution. And there is no very clear definition what this situated is, so everybody refers to Dora Haraway, but all of us do it on our own situated, let's put it like that, way. So my understanding of it is more that it's an alternative term to the local. Local, I think, became a kind of pejorative, and in times of pandemic there was quite a lot about the local, about something what is near, you know. So there was a need to be in contact with the people that are around us, to help, to be solidary with them, and so on. But at the same time, local is something that, is linked also to the national, to the things that are isolated. So situated, as I understand it, is more local to local, and it is it is about space in between. And this space in between is created also with the help of technology, of course. In times of COVID, we communicated via Zoom mostly, so and we continue doing it this way now as well. So, we now have hybrid conferences and so on, and this is something that will stay with us. Situated knowledges, as Dora Haraway describes in her text, is more about the idea that the knowledge is not only it's not objective knowledge, so the object of the research, of the knowledge, is at the same time always the actor and the agent. And this is something that is very near to me. I worked a lot with the region, with Eastern Europe, with the Balkan region, so this is something that is very familiar, how to create the dialogue, how to be also the art agent of course, this is something else than feminist approach of Dora Haraway's, but still. So it is something that is very much about the particularities. So when we talk about future, so it's about the particularity, how we think and how we contribute to the idea of the future. So my voice as a writer of this book is also situated, so I somehow orientated my research to the post-socialist world and to the world that was defined by COVID at that time, and also the autocratic regime. So I wrote about different art practices and curatorial practices from the region related to the research on post-Yugoslavia space, different Yugoslav practices. Also, I mentioned protest art. Ištvan will talk, I suppose, more at that time, in that period in Slovenia, and I put different practices in the context of war, different crises. So it was about linking the different artistic practices to this idea of situated knowledge and situated voices. So the question is also how to think the new cultural production related to everything what has been said. So it is that our cultural production is still very linked to the dominant art system that is about the inclusion, so the alternative way of cultural production would be very critical, as I see it, about the idea of the inclusion. So, for example, how to think about the curatorial practices, or how to think about the participatory art, which most of the cases in the book somehow are about. So I recently, for example, read the short intro to the newly edited book of Claire Bishop, Artificial Health, which you probably all know, on the participatory art. And then she's very self-critical, of course, in that book, and she's thinking what she omitted, and then she adds new things related to race context or to technological context, which probably she was criticized about that she didn't include it. And I thought, but there are probably more and more contexts and things that she could add. Actually, she could go on endlessly, including, and then I come to the idea that it is not about inclusion, but it is about abandoning the ambition of making kind of overview, because overview is something that is not shouldn't be the issue today. So what we have to strive for is not to include new information, but to include new situated voices. And this is then, very much about this situated knowledges, and the question of the future would be also, it's not how to think, how seriously we have to make a research and then to think and to propose something good for all of us, but we have to be active, in all these kind of things that are beyond only one practice. I write a lot about the art that is not only, framed in the art institution or in the concept of art. So then often it goes beyond this artistic concept, and some of the art practices or curatorial practices have kind of double ontology. So they are on one hand art, on the other hand they are, activism or healing, parallel system of healing, parallel economy, whatever. So this is something then I conclude here, the thinking of future is actually not theoretical activity, but should be more practical and active.
Thank you. You laid out now a lot of paths for a possible discussion, but I would come back now actually to the concept of the situatedness, which is, I think, very crucial for your book. And I propose let's dwell on this concept still for a while, to see actually also how other speakers understand and practice maybe this idea of situated knowledge, of situated institutional or curatorial practice. So I invite you, Charles, maybe to share with us your understanding of this concept, or how do you practice maybe within your museum, an Abbemuseum in Eindhoven, this notion, if at all, and then maybe also what you think it's important to acknowledge while practicing situatedness within the global art context.
Yes, thanks, Usha, and I think to say that I think the book is really worthwhile reading, because it lays out a number of concepts which Zdenka's sketched out now, which I think are actually very important to consider if we want to build this future, or just a better present. No, I'm quite resistant to the idea of the future as this sort of endlessly postponed thing. The future never comes, and that's the problem with talking about it. But the present is here, and we need to build a better present in the light of this. And I think when we talk about situated knowledges, I suppose it takes me back to a concept that was quite prevalent in the art world about 20 years ago. I think it's maybe sometimes interesting to compare what has changed in order to understand where we are now. And that was a concept which was borrowed from Rancière, but was really sort of framed by Roger Burgel and Ruth Nowak, who later on curated the Documenta. One of the documenters that disappeared, I think, for all sorts of reasons. But at the time, they were doing a series of exhibitions which was called "How Do We Want to Be Governed?" And I think that question was at the beginning of 2000. So after the war here, when the sort of explosion of sort of capitalist joy that was the 90s elsewhere in the world, with the sort of release of all these resources that have been kept under lock and key by socialism and communism were sort of released into like an adrenaline rush, really, into the capitalist system. That when that was starting to work through the system, and there were kind of thoughts about how we wanted it to be governed, maybe, raised in terms of a kind of optimistic question in a certain sense. It was like, what would be the ideal state? And I'm going to go back to NSK's work and this whole question of the state being something that was very relevant at that time. I think that could the state be a way, could state institutions like museums be places where that idea of imagination, of asking questions about how we might want to be, to determine our collective futures, that they were somehow at stake. And I think what's very interesting now, at least from me, and also this idea of situated knowledges, is that idea of how we wanted to be governed was still, in a certain sense, a sort of universal appeal. No? I think the difference between situated knowledges and what we have, between that idea of a sort of a one-size-fits-all solution called democracy or freedom or liberty or whatever, liberty, equality, fraternity. You know, these ideas that are born very much in Western Europe largely, and then are sort of imposed on the rest of the world in the name of universalism. That's in a way what situated knowledge is I think, attacking. So for me, coming from my background, my people are the progenitors, are the people that produced that idea of universalism, and then claimed that we, particularly men, were the universal figure and everybody else was somehow a deviant from it. And also in Western Europe, to locate ourselves is sort of different from situating yourself here or in other continents in the world. So I think Western Europe has got a particular responsibility to de-universalize itself, if you like, and that would mean to try and situate itself within a particular story. And that's a story that I think we're still learning about. But certainly for the Van Abbemuseum, it's a story that involves demodernizing our narratives, which is taking the old modern idea of a sort of universal truth, an idea of quality in art, in our collections, in our cultural production, which is judged by a small group of people claiming to represent everybody, and actually seeing and analysing what that quality, what that judgment, what the set of judgments, what's excluded from that, what's erased from that set of judgments in order to come to this idea of the universal. So the important thing I think with situated knowledge is that it gives you the opportunity to move away from that old model and not to ask maybe how do we want to be governed, but much more I think moving into territory which is about building relation, about recognizing maybe interdependence rather than independence, which I think was the struggle, I mean certainly here in certain forms in the 90s. This idea of interdependence comes up, I think, 20 years later in a much more important, maybe it's a much more important understanding that we're building relation with each other, which means that that universal position is always going to be undermined by the fact that you're in relation with somebody else who's going to have another position. So these situated knowledges being put into relation undermine any sense in which there is a sort of an ultimate pattern or an ultimate truth. There is a way of governing that could be specific. And it's extraordinary the extent to which the idea of government or the idea of democracy is not really nuanced very much in its sort of ambitions. And then I think what comes in, and it's also in the book that Zdenka wrote, is a question of solidarity and care and art, and how these terms relate to the question of relation and interdependence, and how those can be expressed, because I think solidarity and care are tricky words for us. They often seem to be words that are about the institution taking care of the society or the government taking care of its citizens. But actually in solidarity and care there's a two-way direction. There's a sense in which what do the citizens want to take care of? If it's not, and maybe it's not the state that they want to take care of, maybe it's their relationships between each other. And if that happens, then different kinds of forms might emerge. So these solidarity and care are double-edged swords, I would say. They're not something that's so easy. Solidarity is really to do something which is not in your personal or collective interest for somebody else. It involves a cost, and I think care involves a cost. And often care, I think in these times, is interpreted as a cost-free exercise where there should just be a sort of endless amount of caring for everybody, but not that then is reciprocated. Yeah? So this reciprocal relationship, I think, is also in a way what situated knowledge requires, because otherwise it becomes, as you say, local and bound and essentialist, and that we have our truth and everyone else can go away. Once you build relation, then that truth isn't really at stake. No, it's that this is what I put into the communal, if you like, the relational, and see what comes out of it, having gone through this process, which is a double-edged sword, and which cuts the situated knowledge that you have down to size in relationship to others. And I think that's where it feels a little bit the struggle is happening, and that's happening at a sort of idea of the governmental level, but I think also it's happening in the cultural production. And that's where participation, I think, comes in. So what is the cost of participation for the people who are participating? Because if there isn't a cost, if it's just like a nice free meal or whatever from Curatorial or something that was what it was in the 1990s, then really that's nothing to do with the kind of terms of relationality and solidarity and communalizing, if you like, of producing a communal sense of identity. That I think should be at stake, and that cultural forces and cultural production needs to put. And I think that's where the weakness of Claire Bishop's argument is, because it's depoliticized from precisely these concepts, and then it's just about, are you having a good time or not, and maybe having a good time isn't that great a thing anyway. And I don't think that's really the discussion that we need. I think situated knowledge takes us somewhere else.
Thank you very much. I would invite now Vesna Vuković. As said, you are also co-founder of Blok. This stands for Local Base for Cultural Refreshment. And for example, one of your early activities was Urban Festival, where you explored very much the notion of site-specific art, art in public space, also the rights to the city. Now you run also like several year-long program called Micropolitics. Some years ago you moved to a new location, a neighborhood called Trešnjevka in Zagreb, and you develop a lot of your program connected to this particular neighborhood. For example, Trešnjevka Neighborhood Museum, and then another program initiative, Artists for the Neighborhood program. So even though now we were also discussing the understanding of the local, which is more bound to the physical, that maybe we should overcome and consider situatedness differently, also as in between, as relational approach. I'm curious for your understanding and your way of practicing situatedness, and also being very embedded then in this particular neighborhood.
I will start even earlier from this point where we are now. So at Trešnjevka, we started actually as a students' initiative already in the early 2000. And what was the situated knowledge, I guess, produced through our practice, not just practice, but also through reading, and was mostly derived from what you mentioned about festival. It was a festival. We just used this term more to gain more production resources, not just to have another festival. So we were dealing with this phenomenon of festivalization from the early beginning. But what was in focus of our activities have been artistic practices in outside of usual, let's say, art institutions, so to say, in public spaces. So this brought us normally to the situation where we have to deal with different power relations, different processes that were shaping public space. And it was an interesting period in the sense that after the 80s, which were particular in Croatia due to the war. So the processes of EU integration had just started. So the public space was really transforming very quickly and aggressively. So at this first period we have been dealing with different spatial effects of deindustrialization, of European integration and commercialization, touristification and everything which happened to Zagreb in these years. So I guess it was a way of learning how to be situated. This, of course, also brought us in a very peculiar situation. We haven't been, and we are still, I have to say, somehow, I would use a term, even delinked, or just for the sake of discussion, from the outward as we perceive it, because we are really focused at the local context as well as to the local audience. So Urban Festival was realized in various public spaces, so have been addressing as well as including, if it's not, if it's still politically correct to use the term, or opening spaces for participation, to say it more correctly, for different audiences which haven't been regular art institution audiences. Another very important thing for us was linking with different social movements at that period, mostly movements related to Rise of the City, which was very active in that period. And also we have been situated, as Uška said, we are registered as NGO, non-governmental institution. So we have been part of this booming NGO scene, which was also very, very vivid and during these years, and which was a peculiar phenomenon in the sense that during the 90s the artistic institutions have been used for nationalistic ideology and purposes, very cleansed of most of progressive politics and people there. So, but on the other hand, this NGO scene was somehow self-perceived and perceived as it was still in the 90s, so in 80s, in late socialism, as this beautiful and fine liberal face of Western capitalist world. And so we were at the very beginning also very well aware of our material position in these circumstances, which brought a kind of cultural war in between institutional and non-institutional actors. So this specific tension between those actors is, of course, due to the reasons I have just described. So there was an actual war, but still the processes which were really changing the cultural field, neoliberalizing the cultural field in general, were both being regressive for institutions as well. So they were not excluded from what we know and live today in, and that is project-based work, that is not just cut of public finances, but a very change of the nature, how we perceive public finances and perceive the publicly funded arts and culture. So we have been trying through the various, mostly discursive programs and some research programs as well, to discuss and those those processes, to try to look systematically at the field, so to somehow not to continue, so to say, or not to accept this position of cultural war in which we are at war with the institutions and not part of the same ecosystem, so to say, together with them. And a very decisive moment, I guess, happened after the last financial crisis before this one, so in 2008 and 2009, and together with students' movement. And this political generation, which is a different one from that from the 80s, an older one, which brought again in the public space a materialist perspective on things, and which really changed the public sphere at that period. It was a real rupture in the public space. So after these years, like working really literally on the street, we have gained a space. It's a state-owned space, and we moved to this neighborhood Trešnjevka, which is a very peculiar neighborhood in Zagreb. It's the oldest one. It's developed together with the industrialization of Zagreb as a provincial city of Austro-Hungarian monarchy, still late in the 19th and the beginning of 20th century. It was very much industrialized, so we moved there, and we decided to continue working context-related on this micro level. So this program Artists for the Neighborhood you mentioned has continued this methodology, developed in the framework of Urban Festival, and again now it developed even further to an initiative called Trešnjevka Neighborhood Museum, which is a peculiar virtual museum which has been built through the contributions of neighbors and everyone connected to Trešnjevka and its history, and also the artistic program and exhibition and interventions produced. They started from this virtual fundus of the Trešnjevka Neighborhood Museum. Beside that, we also have several educational programs. Maybe the one of most interest for possible discussion today would be our political school for artists. As I said, we are not so much part of the art world. Because of being so much focused on the local context, we cannot travel around, and it's a decision you have to make. Either you are focused locally or you are working more internationally. And Political School for Artists is a program which deals with art as a part of the system we are living in, part of its relations of production, and it gives insight into the systemic critique of capitalism, into socialist alternative and its history. We go far. As I said, in 19th century, first half of the 20th century, and so on. And also we do discuss a lot of the role and the position of art in the system, which is today a very vibrant question, so to say. And we have been also very much interested, and I'm glad Charles and Zdenka both mentioned the Claire Bishop books, which was also very important for me, because of it is it was really refreshing to read how she tackles certain development and certain interest in the art world for participation linked to the very specific movements, be it revolutionary movements from the beginning of the 20th century, be it non-parliamentary politics of '69, or be it again the dismantling of the welfare state in the 80s and 90s in Croatia, which has a lot to do with why this boom around the participation. She really explains it, for my opinion, very good, how art somehow takes over kind of role which have been before that taken by some forces which have been defeated, such as unions, such as strong political parties. So this transformation of the political field, transformation of workers organizing and things like that, has its consequences for the art field. And it would be a matter of debate later what can we do with it. It's here. How do we position ourselves to that? Is it a space to participate, to work on further? Is it just a certain liberal ideology of a nice artwork which is very progressive, which is very political? On the other hand, it's really at the same time very narrow field. It is symbolically and could be symbolically very important place, but it has its limitations due to its really narrowed span, and so maybe I can finish here. We can open other questions. There's a lot to say.
Yeah, thank you. I think you have a very nice connection to my next question for Ištvan Išt Huzjan. You know, Vesna, you opened now the question of also connection between art and culture and social movements and political movements. One chapter in this book has a title Bicycles, and is devoted to Friday bicyclists' protests here in Ljubljana that were persisting for more than 100 weeks during from 2020 on, and were voicing criticism against at that time undemocratic regime. And Ištvan, you were also very much involved in these Friday protests. And my question goes actually, what is your experience also, because these Friday protests were then also later on included in some of the art exhibitions. For example, Zdenka curated an exhibition bigger than me, Heroic Voices from Ex-Yugoslavia in Maxi in Rome, where also let's say the narration from the Friday protests was part of this exhibition. You were involved. And what is your experience? What is your view on actually maybe the advantages, the benefits of this kind of a platform that you can voice on, or maybe also the danger?
First of all, I think I've been asked a couple of times to individually answer similar questions, and it's really kind of hard in the sense that maybe the best experience of this period was the collective one, and not only the Friday protests that were kind of represented by this symbol that I drew, this red triglav with a bicycle. Maybe about the Fridays somebody else could talk even better about. But I think this period of 40 years, I think the strongest thing was this collectiveness, but also doing things under no name, or maybe under this symbol, but also sometimes without the symbol, because at night you don't see the symbol. No? Maybe this was the best experience, let's say, or the thing that I could say that was the strongest. But there's also been books about this, and I don't know if I can add more about it, but there was this fear always, the link between institution and what was happening in the street. Because there was proposals to, for example, to put some of the graphics that were done on the street, or some of the actions, the documentation that would go into collections, for example, or for exhibitions. And I think there is always kind of a dual feeling about this. I mean, from my position, I'm an artist, and there was always a kind of a goal to be in collections or to represent my work. But then, of course, the political energy or the power that these actions had in the streets, that were sometimes artistic or looked artistic. It felt like that if they would go inside an institution, they would lose all political power. This was very clear. And I don't know, there is this fear of appropriation, no, in a sense. When I'm thinking about this, I can't stop thinking about a recent work by Tercer Quinto. It's a Mexican collective. And recently they've created an alphabet from letters that they took from politically engaging graffitis. So they took photographs of these graffitis, took letters, and then reassembled those letters, digitalized them, and made a typography out of them. And, of course, I think they stripped these graffitis completely off of their power. For example, they don't work in the same way. They don't do anything. But at the same time, because they made a typography, maybe you can write a new protest with that typography. No? So there is a potential of, again, the power within that. And there was a work of which I was also thinking that was in Fanave from Ahmed. Ahmed made this proposal after, I don't remember the name of the, it was an anarchist during the... Yeah, exactly. So his proposal...
Maybe just to explain to the audience who might know who is Ahmed and
okay.
what
So
you talk about.
Ahmed is a Turkish artist. He's about, I think we're the same age, and we met in Holland when we were together at the Rijksacademie. He's a well-known artist. I think he worked with Neue Slowenische Kunsthaus on the Venice Biennial Pavilion. So maybe the local audience knows him from that press. But he was also shown in Ljubljana quite a few times.
Ahmed,
entire Galleria, 100 years ago.
So he made a piece. He made a piece in Fanave. I think it was in Fanave the first time. That was inspired by the Arab Spring uprisings, or particularly Istanbul one, right? So he used found objects that would be usually used to make a barricade on the street, and he put them in the gallery. And then after the proposal of the anarchists, because the Prussians were coming in, and so he proposed that they used artworks from the museum, that they would be put on the barricades to stop the Prussian army, because the Prussian army would not destroy the barricade because they would be afraid to destroy the art. That was the proposal. And but maybe Ahmed, by putting this in the museum, maybe took away from this power that this proposal has. Again, a kind of illustration or an appropriation of something that goes inside the museum and then maybe doesn't work anymore. In that sense, but I I was thinking about what maybe to tell something about this protest that maybe more people don't know that happened, maybe an action. And of course, I thought of the first one that would be linked to Zdenka best in that period, because as we all know, they changed the director of the Moderna Galleria during this period. To me, it was a very political act, no? And it was also recognized already at that time as a political act to change this director. And they were making it even more obvious in that period because they were redoing the open call many times because they had to change the law. And by doing so, they opened up the law. They said that they were doing it so that they would open the market to buying the new director. But in the end, they opened it so much that almost everybody in Slovenia could apply. So there was this proposal put forth that maybe we could, in order to stop this political intervention within the professional field, to kind of bureaucratically stop it. So that let's make an appeal that everybody applies. And it's also during COVID, so you know, when you're invited for an interview, you could always say, oh, I feel bad, I need to make a test, so that you prolong the interview and so on. So we even created a website that was a copy of a website of the Slovenian military. The Slovenian military is postani-vojak.si, and we made a website postani-direktor.si. And it was a website where you would go on and it would tell you how to apply. And if you followed that, you would for sure get an interview. Because you get an interview if you apply correctly. So my mother applied, my sister applied, many people applied. And yes, so I applied as well. And the way I applied is that there is something, so they ask you to apply with a proposal or for a 5-year plan, what you will do as a director in the next term. And me living in the West for 20 years, surviving on the market, I knew they should pay me if I'm giving a 5-year plan. You know, I will not do this for free. I'm not an idiot, right? Like, I will give you my 5-year plan and then you don't take me and you know. No, but I don't want to work for free, so what I did was, because I was anticipating that they would do a political choice, I applied with the SDS party political program. So I copy-pasted their program.
What is the SDS party?
Slovenska demokratska stranka. So it's the right-wing, I would say, extreme right party in Slovenia. So I copy-pasted their cultural program and I applied with that. And they accepted this program. And then we had an hour and a half interview about this topic, which was funny in itself and a kind of maybe a performance or something like that, I don't know. So this was one action that kind of happened, never ended up in a collection or in an exhibition, but I think at least for a while it was kind of effective, really prolonged the process. If there would be if there would be early election, I think maybe this could have gone differently. So it was prolonged for a while. There was another proposal that was actually for you, Charles, but it never came to you. Because during the protest we also figured out, so many people got fined, right? And a lot of times you would argue that it was an artistic action, and that you were asking this to be resolved in the court, so you will not pay the fine. And many times it doesn't go and it doesn't end up in court. But there was a proposal that maybe there could be a kind of solidarity towards the artist from the institutional perspective, so that maybe this could be also internationally, that museums, if an artist is calling this an artistic action, that the museum buys this work. Mm-hmm. And the fee would be paying off the fine of the protest, you know. So that maybe internationally one museum could, save an artist in another country and vice versa and so on. But I think it never came to that, and in the end everybody was acquitted, like nobody went to court. But yeah, maybe in terms of these protests and these periods, am I answering anything?
No, it's great.
Maybe just for a short explanation, when Ištvan was talking about the changing legislation so that everybody could almost apply, it was about the statute, so the basic legal document of the Moderna Galleria, which sets the criteria which should be met by the director of this institution, and this actually document was changed, not the legislation. But I would go now to Tjaša with a very different story. When talking about situatedness, I would say, at least I see it like that. Also during the pandemic, you curated Iskra Delta, so it was like the 34th edition of Graphic Biennale here in Ljubljana. And it seems to me that you found your situatedness in a speculative fiction. The whole biennial was constructed around Iskra Delta as a fictional entity that served as a tool to imagine possible alternative present and future. So now, until now, we were discussing the protest, let's say, activist art connection between art and politics. And so it seems you created a space for fiction, imagination, speculation, and I would like to hear somehow what is your approach to this, why you find this way of working and this tool important.
Yeah, thanks Urška also for inviting me to participate in this talk. So yeah, I was thinking a lot about how to relate this to what was said. I'll try. The unannounced voice of fiction now enters the scene. So, I mean, the questions like somehow like a speculative or fictional turn in art. It's not something that happened during the pandemic. It had its, it happened years before, and maybe during the pandemics, during the lockdowns, became more prominent or important because the traction on reality was somehow taken away from us, right? So also the technologies, the internet, the screens, this was something, our access to reality, and also a certain, let's say, renewed interest in fiction, and also certain ways of fictioning and world building through technologies became in certain arts maybe more pronounced. So this was for sure for the Biennale one maybe framing context, but maybe I should mention that how the Biennale was somehow how it started to form. So it was actually at first a project group that was assembled by the artistic director and the director of the institution, Zdenka Badovinac, and it included an artist, Andrej Škufca, a graphic designer, Vesna Vuković, a film director and musician, Kukla Kešerović, a writer and poet, Mladinsko, and myself, a curator. And we were all from the same generation, and we were all based in Slovenia. So I guess the initial impulse or idea for this edition of the Biennale was already set somehow by the director in terms of just setting the focus or perspective on a certain generation, and also a regional one or like a local one. So this also informed the concept of the Biennale, and this is maybe how we could see how it's, even if it's like a fictional exercise situated in the local context, but it does certain things differently than maybe some other practice that would actually intervene in reality in a more directional manner. So for me, for example, why this fictional approach or fictional turn or speculative turn in arts is interesting. I mean, of course, I was, I mean, I wrote my diploma on a thesis on topics of engaged art practices and critiquing the neoliberal ways of exploiting labor and so on. So somehow this is the context in which I worked for a while, but then especially in this time during the pandemics and through these discussions with the project group, it became somehow maybe more relevant to turn the perspective from the present, from the immediate present towards the future. So first of all, a lot of our, maybe the generational kind of understanding of the situation was that the context is defined a lot by certain nostalgia for the past on the one hand, so certain lost futures that maybe the previous system that our parents experienced promised but never delivered because of the end of history, you know. So, and that this nostalgia for the past is somehow also connected to the condition of capitalist realism as it's like defined by Mark Fisher, in terms of that, I mean, that is not so much nostalgia for the past we had, but nostalgia for the futures we've lost. So in a way, somehow this being stuck in an impossibility of imagining a future that would be different from the one that we inherited, so our present. So besides that, also through these discussions within the project group, somehow to me it became obvious that there is a certain, of course, frustration present with the, let's say, shortcomings of institutional critique, and also certain maybe micro-political interventionist practices that they kind of lost through focusing on just the local, and direct action lost somehow the traction on ever more complex processes that are shaping our reality in the world today, that are planetary scale, that are will have effects in future that we will not live to see, probably even. So climate change being the prominent one now at this point, but of course there are also others. So somehow, how can we actually gain traction in this kind of present that is defined by the future and not so much maybe by the past? So instead of this endless critiquing and dissecting of the present and kind of oppositional practice, we tried to somehow test out this idea of what happens if we actually turn our perspective towards the future and towards propositional practices. So the historical Iskra Delta, so this was actually existing company, computer company, that was a Slovenian computer company that existed in times of Yugoslavia, and was shut down after Slovenia became independent. And it was interesting to us because not so much as like what in actuality happened with it, you know, its history and so on, but more a certain, for us was more important, a certain sentiment that was attached to it. So this sentiment of lost futures that I already mentioned, because Iskra Delta was a quite successful company. It developed its own hardware and software in the context of socialism, and for a while, before the terrain of the information technologies was already hegemonized by the Western companies, it offered the possibility for an alternative. So somehow it also, we understood it when we were talking during these discussions in the project group as maybe linked to, parallel to the non-aligned movement, so somehow like a third path, so not the Soviet technologies, not the Western technologies, but like something else. And of course this potential was lost. So this kind of sentiment around a certain very locally specific case that had this promising future that could deliver a different present for us and didn't, this was somehow interesting as a sentiment that we wanna kind of break through, because it disables us to imagine a different future from the position we're in now. Somehow Yeah, so as I said, the challenges that we're facing today required a different approach. So one that involved this future and more planetary perspective. If we are talking about the future and thinking about the future, we can't avoid, practicing fiction, because future is something that's not here yet and can be either speculated about, and that's what happens on the markets a lot, and it defines our present, but at the same time it can also be imagined, and that can also inform our actions in the present. So I would also, you mentioned that maybe the Biennale turned to speculative fiction. I would say to speculation and fiction, speculation more in terms of speculative design or speculation in theory than speculative fiction, because that's more like, in literary terms, something that describes, or like stories that are fantasy stories, that involve beings that will never exist, we don't want them to exist, we just escape to these worlds to escape the reality we are living in. But actually here, fiction, how I use it is closer to, or maybe similar to how O'Sullivan and Burroughs use it in their book Fictioning, where fiction is used as a verb. So to fiction something. So fiction has a power to produce reality, not just describe it or create an imagination about it. So it's not an imaginary reality we escape to, but actually some tool to transform or intervene in the reality we inhabit. So fiction also, we discussed that it was important that it concerns realities to come. So somehow we could also think about alternatives in that sense. So alternatives are something that are in the territory of the possible, or something that might actually become actual, but is not completely actual yet. And thinking about this relationship between situatedness and fiction, then I remembered, I read a really interesting text by Patricia Reed, and she's one of the members of xenofeminist collective Laboria Kubonix. It was published in Glasgow Journal Online, and it's titled Freedom and Fiction, where she tries to, I'm not going to explain the whole article because I didn't reread it for this occasion, but she tries to somehow make an argument that fiction also, in terms of how it's situated in the world, it not just derives from a certain situated perspective and position, but it also enables reimagining of that situation. So somehow it always brings, even if it opens up the space for, or the possibility to create something new, or reform or transform the situation that defines us, or the perspective that we hold or we start from. So for the Biennale, fiction was also important in terms of, as I mentioned, this internet context, not just because of the lockdown, but because social media and the internet proved to have a really reality transformative and disruptive political power in the last couple of years through fake news, memes, and memeing politicians into offices and so on. So in a way that's a problem, right? But at the same time it signals that new informational technologies actually created a new terrain, which is a fragmented terrain of multiple competing realities or ideas of what reality is. So institutions that provided this stable consensus on reality are failing, or are being dismantled on purpose. This is somehow a contemporary relativism, right? So in a way, engaging with fiction as a reality producing tool is important also for this reason, not just to critique the situation, but also to be able to navigate it and to actually participate in it in a way as to transform it. So the position of transforming from within, not from the outside, was important for the Biennale. And of course, then, as I mentioned at the beginning, a lot of art that is being created in the last couple of years shows this interest in fiction, also in Slovenian context, also regionally. So the Biennale also kind of tried to use this idea of Iskra Delta, or this entity, as a fictional framework to present practices that have this kind of approach to fiction as a reality producing tool, let's say. And so there's a lot of young art. It presented mostly artists under 40 years of age from the region. And a lot of these artists are not just interested in fiction as a genre, like from sci-fi literature or, I don't know, movies and new weird and old weird and so on, but more importantly also as a practice of world building. So this was also one of the concepts that was important. So LARPing, live action role playing, role game playing, video games, AI simulations. So tools of creating certain conditions or setting for a certain world to emerge. So actually settings that you play out and you perform, and in that sense make fiction bleed into reality, or somehow fiction becomes reality for a certain period of time. So in a way, what you mentioned, like you created this symbol of a trigger with the bicycle is somehow like a brand that people can relate to, or like that is like a brand that has a certain idea behind it or vision of a world that we want, and people somehow take it as their own, and then they disseminate it further. And that was also the idea how the Biennale was somehow curated. So as this brand of Iskra Delta, which is an entity that comes from the future, which is not the old one, and that the works, the projects from artists help to co-create. So they are building blocks of this world. And of course, they don't all have the same vision of the world. And they are not talking about the future even. A lot of them, or most of them, were actually already dealing with or performing or testing out different possible alternative models of the present. So these are already sparks, as we call them, because Iskra in Slovenian is spark, of the worlds that can come into existence if we make them to become mainstream. So in a way, fiction is already here all the time. So it's already in these parallel possibilities that are being maybe fragmented, but they're not the norm yet. So the critical power of fiction somehow here is also that, because at the beginning I kind of placed it on the other side, so we have critical practices that just critically present, and then we have fictional practices that produce it or try to create a different one. I'd say that the critical power of fiction is actually when fiction is set and affirmed within a given reality. So the Biennale also had this very affirmative stance. So it didn't represent the practices, but it actually took them as reality and actually acted according to their rules. So it performed also together with the audience, the headquarters of it was like a big LARP, of course not on the scales as I would wish, because that would need to include the whole institution from top down, and actually consider the institution also as a LARPing entity, which all institutions are. They just LARP, live action role play, the same reality that we take for the reality, but they could also LARP something else. But of course within these constraints, the Biennale tried to actually be this performative event. So yeah, in this sense it was rooted in the local context, but at the same time it also tried to connect it, or the sentiment, to connect the sentiment to more general, like global problem of trying to reimagine the future, and at the same time also framing certain practices from the region, but of course there were a couple from the West as well, as building blocks of this new world that is rooted in the local, let's say, potential for reimagining the present. So maybe it is for now, and then I can add something more in the next question.
Thank you. Zdenka, how all this resonates with you? You had some notes. Would you like to maybe comment on something or somebody else of what was said?
Yeah, it is, of course, it is, as Tjaša said, that you started, I don't know how this will relate to what everybody before said. So I think that this fictional dimension is probably something that I don't refer in the book, but I think it's very important, and it is very much in the contemporary art about it, and it has a really very important critical power. I don't know exactly what to do with this, let's say, situated knowledge, if I translate the Iskra Delta legacy with it. So as I understood you, you put it more in the context of the fiction and nostalgia and everything. So it doesn't, it completely loses this emancipatory power that it used to have. Or am I wrong?
Yeah, I mean, actually, we wanted to avoid the nostalgia, right? Mm-hmm. So I would say that Iskra Delta, like the situated knowledge, was something, the knowledge of that is yet to come. So of course it has roots in the now, but it doesn't repeat what is now, but it tries to show what are the vectors of what are the vectors of the world that we would want to, let's say, have from our perspective, from the regional context and so on, and in relation to the shift to the artists and their practices. I mean, I wouldn't say that that's not emancipatory. I think fiction, in that sense, taken as a practice to change reality, it actually offers a way of alienating and distancing yourself from your conditioning, let's say, or your conditions that constrain your thinking, and actually this alienation enables you to opens up the possibility for this transformation. Of course, it doesn't mean that directly translates into politics. Of course not, but somehow, you know, just capturing or encouraging this act of imagining and also trying to test it out, it already is creating a small prototype of a reality that we want. So in that sense, I think that it has an emancipatory power.
Yeah, but I was not referring to fiction per se, but to this local knowledge, you know, maybe something like this Chinese philosopher that you know, also writes about, you know, how important it is to have this local science and local, you know, technological knowledges from the past to compete and to create a dialogue with the dominant channels of, you know, distributing and using the technology and science for different purposes of domination. So I was more referring to it than to fiction. I know fiction as art and, you know, have emancipatory power.
Is there some question already in the public or a comment?
Thank you for these presentations. I'm really looking forward to read the book, Zdenka, and of course my question is for you and maybe also for Charles about the situated knowledge. Maybe you can tell us some examples of that situated knowledge and how situated knowledge changes the institution, how it affects the institution, since you both work in an institution and I'm also working in an institution. I would be interested to hear maybe.
Okay, I mentioned already my situated experience with referring to the situated knowledges concept. So it is, as Dora Haraway put it, about treating the object of research at the same time as the agent and actor. So I think, and you know it, and you were part of all these researches on Eastern European art and collection and everything. that we have done in Moderna Galleria, and I think that the regional knowledge is very often this object of the research from the side of the dominant system. So I think what we have been striving for is exactly this, transforming it to the actor and agent. So this is my personal contribution to this concept of the situated knowledges, which can be very broad. And Dora Haraway refers it mostly to the feminism.
But I don't understand well, maybe, when you say knowledge as an agent, what do you mean by that?
You have the object of the research, and through the research you create a knowledge, and you treat the object as something that it is only a screen, so you project your knowledge on it and you try to create a dialogue with it, but without taking it as something that influences back, that co-create the knowledge.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. I think how it changes is that each, again, it's different, I think, between a Western European institution that pretended the universal and something like a national modern art museum in Slovenia, which in a way never had that pretension. Also, Banaba had a pretension to universal access to a universal narrative of modern art, starting in the late 19th century. And so, partly situating that is to unpack that story and make it something that's present. So looking at what made modern art and how that story was generated. And then it's about not telling that story anymore, but telling a particular story about being in Eindhoven in an institution which is a colonial institution founded on tobacco industry and founded on the exploitation of labour in the plantations, but also in the factories. Now that's something that also is true, for example, for the Tate Museum in London, but they don't talk at all about their roots in sugar plantations and exploitation still to this day, which is quite shocking in a way that they still don't locate themselves. But I think there's a conflict between a narrative of the universal and locating yourself in these stories. So it's important for us as a museum at least to start with those stories, which are not really artistic stories particularly, but they're stories of the reason that an art museum exists in the first place. And then I think it's to be, in a way this is what Zdenka is saying as well, what we call constituency working, which is actually to be responsive to the communities that surround the museum. And say in a city like Eindhoven, which is a particular design technology city, it means shifting the collection away from this idea of fine art or autonomous art, we call it in Dutch, towards these art utile or art as a tool functions, and then eventually towards sort of social design activity. So you move the direction of the collection away from a sort of universal idea of art embodied by this modern narrative of impressionism to cubism to conceptualism to participatory art or whatever, and you start to respond to what is there. And I think as you do that, then the story of art that we tell will become much more located or situated in where we are, and it won't be the same story as a story told in Amsterdam. And we come from an idea that essentially we're all telling the same story in the Netherlands, that all those modern art museums are essentially fighting. In some cases in the 1970s and 80s, they were literally competing about the same work of art by the same 10 artists. There were 10 artists, 7 of whom were Americans, and they were basically buying those works constantly. And every collection has endless Solowitz and Donald Judd's and Lawrence Wiener's in its stores. I'm not sure quite what to do with them now, I think, increasingly, but that was what the story was. And now I think we're trying to differentiate ourselves, but that differentiation then is based on where you are. And that's a big step for Western Europe, because it's never been able to locate itself. So, also the relation to the agricultural community around us is something that we're really interested in trying to forge links with that agricultural community, which is under a lot of pressure at the moment because of nitrogen nitrogen release or whatever. And so that whole process is something that I think we're still learning how to be situated. I don't think we've got an answer to that, but I think it means that you tell a story where somebody would come in with the story of art from the Museum of Modern Art in New York and not really recognise anything that they were seeing anymore. Everything, even if it's artists that they know, they'd be put in contexts which weren't fathomable if you believe that this was the MoMA in New York dictated the narrative that we all follow.
I think it's very different, also, if you apply to the institutional context, each institution can define it differently. I believe that Blok and how you co-produce the knowledge together with people, like a grassroots knowledge. I think this is specific experience that is very different than mine, what I was describing, but still we can put both in the same frame of situated knowledge.
You want to say something, or? I mean, the question for me is actually now we were now displaying a very different understanding of situatedness and situated work in different settings, curatorial, cultural, institutional, and so on. So what is also very much underlined, Zdenka, in your book is this notion of interdependence, and as Charles also stressed, is the question of building relations. So how to build relations and how to work, from this understanding of interconnectedness between all these different situatedness. How actually, maybe you as a museum director, how would you approach to that, and especially also what Tjaša brought into discussion when we bring into discussion of interdependence even the planetary perspective, then we have so many more potential voices of fungi and soil and so how we build then these relations and work with this interdependence between all these different voices.
I think with pandemic, of course, the interdependence became more like the topic. So it became very clear how we depend also on the nature, on the industry, and the nature is more connected, for example, and dependent on each other that we would think. But you questioned me as a museum director how I relate to it. So I would say that this.
Sorry, just maybe to explain what I mean, because like when we talk about the interdependence and building relation and working with different kinds of situatedness, it's also a question of, I would say, political representation. Giving a certain platform to so many different voices. So how to work with this, and also to avoid certain flattening of this very specific voices.
Yeah, so I think that we are in the institution in a certain condition of mesopolitics. We are between macro and micro politics of the practices that I define somehow in the book, like participatory, socially engaged practices that very often create kind of micro politics. So they create, they work with the communities, they create parallel infrastructure, they create conditions for solidarity, care, and it is very often that we speak about the micro politics as something completely detached from the macro politics. So, the actors in the field, they would say they would not really trust the macro politics, and they would say we have to trust ourselves and our own practices. So it is then the question for the institution where we are, so are we only the actors that present the micropolitics? Now I'm referring to, of course, to the specific art practices, And I think that art always changes the model of the institution. It is from the beginning of the century, it is from the MoMA when it was established in the end of the 20s. It was conceived after the modern art concept as autonomous, and so we have now the art of duration, the art that is deeply involved in life, let's say. So how to then build the new vision of the museum when we deal with this kind of contemporary art that is, as I said before, has certain kind of double ontology, and it has a duration. I did in Moderna Galleria once some years ago an exhibition 1-to-1. When I said the exhibition is only one stop in the lifespan of the art project. So, and we have to think this also in terms of presenting or better working with artists as the partner, because very often they also create organizations, so we deal, the team of the artwork became the organization and the work itself. So it's very important question how the institution comes in a dialogue with this type of art. So do we only present art, or we speak in the name of the art that is happening somewhere else, and then it has only this one stop in the museum. So that's why I'm now trying to conceive this idea of the mesopolitics, so that we are somewhere between the formal politics, macro politics, and everything what is happening in the field.
Thank you. Would like somebody to comment or to add something? Maybe still some question or comment. And slowly we will also have to wrap up. Maybe.
Okay, go ahead. I'll ask after you.
I will maybe open a new field, so maybe it's...
Okay. I just wanted to pick up on what Zdenka said about art changing the institutions. I think this is super important, and that's also for the Biennale. That was something how I tried to understand the practices we were showing, but you could understand any art practice like that, like a reality model. And then, even if it's not duration or engaged, even a painting, suprematist painting can be a totally different reality model than the ones, the realist ones that came before it or something like that. So what would it mean to, it's the same question as was posed to Ištvan actually. What does it mean to place this reality model in an institution that has a certain LARP by itself? And if an institution takes this as a new reality, how does it need to change itself? So, maybe the question would be here, of course, there are constraints for public institutions, the legal aspects of it and everything, and the financial ones, but still probably there are some small attempts how the institution tried to change in relationship to a certain art practice that it wanted to include. So maybe if Zdenka has some examples from her own practice or some other exhibitions that she finds interesting to point out, I would be happy to hear it.
Yeah, there was in the same exhibition 1-to-1, we invited an artist, Marko Sančanin, who was there to repair the institution. So his task was actually to work with us, with me as a curator of the exhibition, and he conceived interesting concept of the crypt as well, because he found in the Museum of Contemporary Art Metelkova, he found a space in the cellar where the cleaning women drank their coffee, It was not planned for anything from the side of institution or of the architect. So it was something that the workers created the meaning. So this is important, that you, when you work in the institution, that you calculate also on this kind of model of the crypt, that you always create a space where things can happen that you as a representative, as a curator or director, can't completely control. And this is also something that I learned from art. So I agree, fiction and art is kind of blueprint for the institution and reality in the context that we are talking about. So it is important then that you, as an institutional person, try to articulate and to include it in the vision of the museum somehow. That you create institution. You help to keep the institution as the institution in becoming. That you don't completely close the idea of it. Am I clear?
So maybe just one thing about what you said, Tjaša, which I thought was really important, and it's maybe a difference between my generation and your generation, which is that I think we wasted far too much time being critical. And what you said is that you needed to move from the critical to the propositional. And I think that's desperately needed now. And I think that we're still stuck sometimes in those modes of criticality, which are, in a certain way, completely banal, because I think nobody believes now. I mean, we had to face a system that was in growth. Neoliberalism was at its was at the beginning of the curve, if you like, and now it's at the end of its curve. So at the end of its curve, the idea of being critical about it is kind of just a given. No, it doesn't work. We know this. We know that capitalist realism is not providing anything for anything beyond a very limited number of people, and even for them, if you look at Elon Musk, it's not producing very much for him even. So there's a certain point where it's clear that criticality is wouldn't necessarily say successful, but it's clearly been established. And now is the time, I think, this question of how do we need to be governed is no longer how do we need to improve the existing system, but how do we need to think beyond it. And I think that's where proposition and fiction are really important. So it was great to hear.
And actually, this is also what you, Zdenka, underline in the book, that actually it is time to go beyond criticality within the museum institutions or art institutions, just to find actually this quote, it became clear now, you refer actually also the experience of the pandemic and increasing social tensions. It became clear that the museum needs to make a complete turn from institutional critique to more concrete work with society. I mean, you propose different approach maybe than you, Tjaša, but yeah, there is this awareness of the step away from the institutional critique to maybe a critical work. So maybe you still wanted to note something?
Yeah, I wanted to add something. It's a bit off the things we have said, but thinking of Donna Haraway and her concept of situated knowledge as a critique of objectivity, which is not actually, as I read it and reread it now, it's really interesting for me to read Donna Haraway again as a critique of objectivity as such, but as critique of this postmodernist relativism, as I read it nowadays. So everyone is entitled to his, her, their own opinion, which is also symptom of this individualism we live in, and the artwork is really like, I won't say birthplace, but the ideological picture of this individualism. And for me, there is, she reveals this neutrality, this fiction of neutrality, and there is a place in the book. There are many. This essayist writing is always full of thoughts which are just opening. The fact is that most parts of the art system aren't privileged. So I just wanted to add, we have talked a lot about institution changing, artworks are there, however, but we haven't mentioned those producing the artworks. And Zdenka also said in her book that museum can be, I have to find it, I read that, can create microenvironments that aren't fully dependent on the dominant art system, which is really intertwined with, in this globalized form nowadays, with capital, with a lot of capitalist industries such as tourism, educational industry, building industry, and things like that. So it's a more of a comment, but is there a way to think about change or solidarity or care or it's a question for everyone.
That's a good question, Dan.
Yeah, would you like to say something? Because the question of care and solidarity is also crucial, and in the book, and actually it's a question how to nurture and sustain this beyond this immediate crisis. Like you know, in the pandemic, this was very much highlighted, but now it seems we got a little bit suffocated. We are just somehow accepting slowly, it seems, this pre-COVID normal. So the question would be how to sustain the care and the solidarity beyond this always immediate crisis where it emerges but then it fades out. I mean, we are again on a durational work, you know, so and also like how to sustain actually the social and also environmental encounters that are lasting, that are transformative. Yeah.
Unfortunately, we think about care and solidarity more in immediate crisis than after, which is wrong, of course. But I remember when everything started, we had many meetings on Zoom, the international directors, and we were thinking how to use our budget in the situation that we faced at that moment. And Charles, you will help me. So it was like the priority appeared to help the artists and the museum workers who were at that time who lost the jobs, who lost the opportunities to make income. You know, so we try to help them. Trying to make some changes in our programming and budgeting, and I think we were also successful. We did some things in these terms. Now, after let's say after all this is over, hopefully, I don't know if I am a little bit self-critical. I think that we haven't. Work much after it, you know, on this experience of a pandemic, which I think was very important and very strong. So we are, of course, still in Simon, the museum international organization. There is this special program, Museum Watch, when we try to point out the colleagues, institutions, artists in crisis, and we try to be solidary with them. And the same we do in International. But more than that, I don't know. Charles, what is your opinion? What is your impression?
I think,
did we do enough, or we should?
No, I agree. I mean, I think there's a certain trauma that we all live through collectively in different ways, of course, and with situated realities. And I don't think, you know, what I struggle with is that there's no real public acknowledgement in the public discourse around the fact that societies have gone through this trauma of separation and isolation. And I think it makes everybody extremely sensitive to criticism, sensitive to wary of collaboration. I think levels of trust are much lower in society now than they were before, in general. I noticed that in the museum, but I think it's also true. Everything, you know, and obviously social media and this sort of manufacturing of extreme positions and of sort of random insults that can be just issued without any responsibility, that obviously doesn't help. But I do think that the trauma that I think we should talk about corona not only as a health issue for the body, but as psychological trauma that happened to us through separation. And I don't see that yet happening, and I don't think we're doing it. I agree. I don't see it happening at the level of the public debate, and that worries me a bit, because obviously we know what happens with trauma if we think about psychoanalysis, that it comes back in some pretty unpleasant ways.
So I think I'm now talking more in general, like in institutions, we didn't do much to learn from this situation of a sick body or endangered body, to find a proper way to work on the idea of health society, you know. So from this, I think this is something that is still in front of us, you know, to work on the question of healthier society, metaphorical, of course.
Can I just, from the position of an artist, so let's say when this country of ours had this change in power and protests started, it was a lot of artists who were engaging, and they were kind of showing solidarity, but also defending these ideals of, let's say, I think the first article of the Slovenian Constitution is Slovenia is a democratic republic, and the second article is it's a lawful and social state. And this was also read in the street when the police was taking these people away and so on. But when institutions were attacked, or non-governmental institutions were attacked and so on, there was kind of solidarity from ground up. But there was not always solidarity from up down. And so there was this, let's say, a fight, and it felt like that there could be an end to a fight. But there was also a big disillusion at the end of this fight, not just that there was a successful change in government, but I think this dissolution from the creative field resulted now in self-organizing. So for the first time now, there was now we have an artist union, you know, which I think is an important point of the end of this period, let's say. But it's actually not the end. And here I would refer, I think it's Srečko Horvat in the Poetry from the Future. He refers to Zapatistas and their understanding of time, not being linear, but like in a, I don't know how this clock is called, it's sand clock. And you have the grains of sand, so that you can see one grain of sand in the future falling in the moment of going through, but also in the past. In a sense that it's our struggle today doesn't have an end. It's the same struggle of the past, and it's the struggle of the future. So there is just struggle. So the fight is never finished. The revolution is never finished. It never happens, right? And it feels in a way still at the present.
But I think Zapatista is a really good example, and there are others as well, for lots of reasons. But one is they don't ask how do we want to be governed; they govern themselves, right? And that's in a way I think, where we need to be going.
I think we should conclude slowly. Thank you all so much for coming and sharing with us, and you, dear audience, I invite now all of us as in between, between all the many struggles, for some moment of conviviality. I welcome you outside. We have some food and drinks, and please, you're very welcome to spend some time still with us. We can go on with discussion. Thank you so much for coming.